Did you know that Halloween and Appalachian extra-biblical supernaturalism share similar Celtic origins? It's tempting to assume that most residents of the Southern Bible Belt have a familiar association with the theological basis of their religious beliefs. Though that assumption may be true for many, there are a number of Southerners who unwittingly carry with them old world ways regarding superstitions, apparitions, and premonitions. Folks such as these are demonstrating a link to the past. The attitudes that support the existence of the supernatural are similar to beliefs that were common among the Celts in pre-Christian Europe. The ideas that support beliefs in extra-biblical supernaturalism are preserved like other aspects of culture. As David Hackett Fisher informs us in his Albion Seed, a great book by the way, intelligent backcountry people had no better system for explaining the uncertainties of the secular world. A backcountry woman who he quotes captures the essence of this notion, and I quote, "Speaking for my own people, I'm sure that almost everyone has had some experience he cannot explain away. Perhaps he's heard a warning of someone's death, a strange noise, a shriek on the roof. Perhaps a man has passed him in the open road and disappeared suddenly, leaving no tracks. My people, like the Hindus and the Scotch Highlanders, have the faculty of dealing with the occult and seeing and hearing that which is withheld from more highly educated minds. Always there is some souvenir of the spirit world in the nook of the mountaineer's brain. He's unwilling to accept it, never believes quite all that it seems to imply. Still, there it is." End of quote. Today on the Vantage Point, we're going to take a look at the connection between supernatural ideas in Appalachia with the Celtic lands of North Britain. I hope you'll join me. Historian Roy Strong tells us that the Celts of the pre-Roman era were dominated by the supernatural in the form of spirits of woods, rivers, sea, and sky. Religious rites and ceremonies took place in sacred groves in which, when the gods were angry, propitiation was offered. The Druids, who were drawn from the noble class, were the Celts' intercessors with the spirit world. They used charms, magic, and incantations to deal with the gods. While it's not so obvious, extra-biblical supernaturalism is an acknowledged part of life for a portion of the people living in the American Upper South. But most do not recognize the pre-Christian origins of their attitudes about superstitions, premonitions, and apparitions. The so-called problem of the Scots' involvement in the supernatural was so common in Scotland that in 1563, Mary, Queen of Scots, signed a bill authorized by Parliament to prosecute witches. A witch was anyone who performed charms, claimed the ability to see into the future, or was associated with any other manifestation of the supernatural not ascribed by the will of God, or to the will of God. King James, her son, was so convinced of the presence of witches that he wrote a book on how to discover and punish them. While Americans remember the Salem witch trials and think they are unique or unusual occurrences, Scotland in the 17th century tried much harder to stamp out superstitious behavior. Some 30 years after the death of King James, hundreds of people who were guilty of having a premonition or a visitation from a spirit were tried by the CROOK and condemned to death by burning. The CROOK, of course, was the Celtic or the Scottish Church. 2 witches were burned in the small Perthshire village of Dunning. In the nearby town of Auchterarder, one woman was burned as a witch after she simply walked by a man who was working his cattle. One of his animals became ill and another died of sickness within a few days. It was believed that she had placed a hex on the beasts. A few miles to the south of Dunning, in the village of the CROOK of DEVON, how about that for a name of a village, a dozen people, including a man, were tried and burned as witches. The trials were held in 1662. One of the defendants was found guilty but was not burned at the stake because she was pregnant at the time. When it comes to ghosts and hauntings, they are big business in Scotland. Cities such as Edinburgh offer ghost walks in the evening hours. Places and structures that have any connection with celebrities from Scotland's past are keen to promote them as part of the local scene. They are popular with both locals and tourists. In the backcountry of Appalachia, the supernatural ideas of the old country are still believed by many. The CROOK and the transatlantic journey could not eradicate the temptation to explain the unknown forces of nature with superstitious notions. The stories that we are going to explore in the Vantage Point reflect the persistence of this Celtic pre-Christian folk tradition. My Scots-Irish, French Huguenot, and Welsh roots run deep in southern Appalachia. I grew up under the watchful care of my maternal grandparents, seeing, hearing, and tasting a world that I took for granted. East Tennessee was the center of the universe as far as I was concerned. Since my youth spent among family and friends, pressed tightly together by the closeness of the deep valleys and rugged hollers, I've observed with amazement the evidences of Celtic settlement across the South. As a professor, college administrator, and researcher, I've lived in 7 southern states, the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, and in Scotland. I've also lived in Michigan for several years, so I've had some experience with the North's Anglo-Slavic culture. As I did when I was away at college, I still look forward to trips back home. I recall a return visit to see my folks about 28 years ago. I felt the urge to rent a movie, which you had to go to a video store back in those days to get a movie. After canvassing everyone in the home to find out if they had a preference, I grabbed my keys off the bar and darted out the door. Feeling youthful, I leapt off the wooden porch, passing my grandfather as he walked up the stairs. My juvenile action forced him to fix his attention on me. When I was about halfway to the car, I realized I was missing my wallet. I turned around and started back toward the house. Pop yelled out to me, "Boy, what you think you're doing?" "I forgot my wallet," I answered. "Son," he replied, "don't you know it's bad luck to turn around once you started off somewhere?" Suddenly, I remembered my childhood instruction on how to avoid bad luck. I asked him if he'd get it for me, and of course the loving and protective Pop fetched it. Gardening at my family's home was also governed by the supernatural. Each year, Pop would ask Nanny, my grandmother, if the signs were right for planting potatoes, corn, or beans. Pop's fishing habits were also governed by the supernatural. He would fish only on those days in which the signs were right. Pop was convinced that the Earth sits still in space, and that the sun actually orbits around the world in a manner that is clearly rooted in theories of the universe that were in vogue during the Middle Ages. One of my fondest memories of him occurred when I was 12 years old. My Uncle Cleo and I had debated Pop on the nature of the Earth's orbit. My grandpa was clearly not a theologian, but he steadfastly maintained his position by stating, and I quote, "The Bible says the sun cometh and the sun goeth." When I told him that the Earth spins on its axis at just over 1,000 miles per hour, and that the seasons change because the Earth is tilted 23.5 degrees, he laughed and shook his head. If we was moving like that, we'd fly every which way. Ain't no telling where we'd end up. Tired and perplexed, we went to bed around midnight. The next morning, my bald, round, and jovial grandfather joined Uncle Cleo and me in the kitchen, where he proudly announced that he got cold during the night. With that said, he grabbed his belly with both hands and barked out with a hearty lift in his voice, "I reckon the Earth slung me way up north through Detroit sometime during the night." He died in 1995, never convinced that he had spent 82 years on Spaceship Earth. As Pop's story shows, biblical and superstitious ideas frequently coexist with other peculiar notions that are rooted in beliefs that have their origins in Europe's Dark Ages. Superstitious ideas associated with pregnant women are among the most interesting traditions I know. In rural Cherokee County, North Carolina, there was a lady named Elsie Craig who was pregnant sometime during the war years of the 1940s. According to Vernita Voiles, Mrs. Craig had an experience while visiting a friend that seemed to validate a superstitious notion. It was a beautiful day for a stroll along the mountain route that Mrs. Craig followed to her friend's house. The beauty of the clear blue sky and the absence of any traffic on the dry dirt road made the day seem as though nothing could possibly go wrong. When Elsie arrived at her friend's home, her host had just pulled a chocolate cake from the oven and had cut it into 2 crescent-shaped pieces. The cake was steaming, and the kitchen smelled like a bakery. Elsie wanted a piece of that cake so badly that she had to restrain herself, for she feared her ravenous appetite would make her look like a pig. She smacked her cheek so hard it left a red mark on her face. When her baby was born, it had a brown, crescent-shaped birthmark on its cheek. Another backcountry woman experienced the supernatural while walking down a dirt road. It also happened in Cherokee County, North Carolina, during the years of the Great Depression. The woman was in the first trimester of her pregnancy. She was walking down the road, apparently involved with her thoughts, and did not notice a large rattlesnake coiled only a few feet from her. When the pregnant woman saw it and heard the rattle, she jumped with fright. Her right hand landed with tremendous force on her right thigh. She apparently hoped to frighten the serpent, but the snake continued its threatening rattle. When she gathered her thoughts, she realized that the snake was just at a striking range. She was able to take a few steps back and move to the other side of the road. Out of harm's way, she made it home safely. Like Elsie Craig, when she delivered her baby, the object of her emotional experience was emblazoned on the infant. The child had a birthmark on its right thigh. The mark formed a snake-like pattern. My grandmother, Vernita Voiles, was victimized by this unknown but powerful force. In 1934, she and her mother, Sarah E. Payne, person that I named my daughter Sarah after, were hoeing corn in the mountains of Sandy Gap, North Carolina. Vernita, Nanny, was pregnant with my mom, and her mother was there to help her in the fields because her husband, Rufus Pop, was out of state looking for work. With only themselves to care for the fields, the 2 women attacked their chores with resolve. Trees lined the edge of the cornfield, and one of them was a healthy apple tree. Nanny spotted a luscious, ripe fruit on one of the highest limbs. She stopped her work, walked over to the edge of the garden, and stood in the shadow of the tree. As her mother caught up with her, Vernita said out loud, "I'd sure like to have that apple up there." Sarah recognized her statement as a request and said, "I believe I can reach it with my hoe." Sarah was able to strike the apple with her tool, and when she struck it, the apple came down so fast that neither woman could react in time to catch it. Vernita tried to move out of the way, but the falling fruit slammed into the back of her head and neck. Vernita's baby Dorothy, my mom, was born a few months later. She greeted the world with an apple-shaped birthmark on the back of her head and neck. Interestingly, Dorothy's great-granddaughter, my granddaughter, has the same apple-shaped birthmark on her neck. As entertaining as these stories may be to a more sophisticated audience, they serve the people of the backcountry in many practical ways. Some superstitious teachings are designed to control the behaviors of potentially wayward children. I recall being told this one: "Singing at the table, whistling in bed, devil come and get you by the hair of the head." I've yet to find that passage in the Bible. One of my favorite warnings to kids involves the infamous boogeyman, which has its roots in Scotland. I remember hearing, "You kids better get in this house, the boogeyman's going to get you." I never saw the boogeyman, but I knew if I ever did, my luck was gone. Umbrellas have the power to give us bad luck, but only if we open them in the house. Also, if a black cat crosses the road in front of you, bad luck is your fate. Of course, walking under a ladder and breaking a mirror were also reasons to expect bad luck. The presence of superstitious beliefs in the upland South is beyond debate. The roots of these ideas are in the Celtic lands of Europe. Well, I hope you'll join me next time when we take a look at ghosts in the backcountry. They too share a Celtic origin.